Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this live discussion for Law Week 2020 on overseeing the use of police powers during the pandemic. I'm Lynne Haultain. It's a very great pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and I'll introduce you to our all-star lineup very shortly. But first, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, wherever you may be, listening or viewing, and to all of us scattered across the Melbourne business district. It's a variety of traditional owners, I think, but we pay our deep respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Well, these are very challenging times, and they have required pretty strong responses from a number of different quarters. Police, of course, have got a very key role to play in delivering on the government's mandate to keep us all safe. So what is the role of Victoria Police in the time of COVID? We'll explore that in some depth in just a moment. But together with the new enforcement task for VicPol, it's also critical at times like these that there is an appropriate match of scrutiny and oversight. So we understand exactly what police are doing, and that there is an opportunity for great transparency on that action. So how are the agencies that are charged with that oversight operating now in these new times, and what are they seeing? We'll explore both sides of that equation in just a moment, but let me introduce you first to our panellists. Shane Patton, APM, who is Victoria Police Deputy Commissioner, Regional Operations, a role he's held since November 2018, responsible for all 4 regions: transit and public safety, state emergencies and support command, and family violence, and a face we've become very familiar with on our TV screens over the last few months. Previous to this, Shane was Deputy Commissioner Specialist Operations, responsible for crime, counter-terrorism, road policing, forensics, intelligence and covert support and legal services. I think all that on a business card would take up both sides in tiny font. Great to have you with us, Shane. Kristen Hilton is with us, Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commissioner, a role that she's held for almost 4 years. And Kristen is very well versed in the public interest issues that are emerging around COVID-19, having previously worked in legal assistance with Victoria Legal Aid and at the Public Interest Legal Clearinghouse. So she's very familiar with both the criminal and the civil law dimensions and the human rights aspects that emerge at times like these. And Katie Miller is also our guest, Deputy Commissioner with the Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission, with a focus on police oversight in her role. She was the past president of the Law Institute of Victoria and co-host, as many of you will be familiar, with the ABC Melbourne weekly health and legal program called Writs and Cures, which I can thoroughly recommend to you. So Katie clearly has a very keen interest in public engagement around the law, and obviously a particular remit around police oversight and how tech is being applied in access to justice. So welcome to you all, and thank you for your time. Let's kick straight into it. So Shane, I'm interested to know exactly, because I think in the mists of time over the last 2 months, which feel like millennia, we've probably become a little less clear about what exactly the laws were that were introduced. So what new powers, if any, did VicPol get around the pandemic? And what are you doing now that you didn't before?
Thanks, Lynn. Well, the reality for us, we didn't actually get any new powers as such. What we saw with the state of emergency being declared from the 16th of March, we've seen Victoria Police have to take on the role to enforce restrictions that have been imposed by the Chief Health Officer. So no new powers for us. We still have the existing powers of arrest under 458, 459 of the Crimes Act, common law powers. So the only new thing for us is we now have new infringible offences, or offences we can charge with, and that's for a breach of the restrictions. And that has been a whole raft of different restrictions that people have seen: stay-at-home directions, restricted activity directions, which restrict movement, being in certain places, businesses operating, The only real change for us is that we previously haven't had to infringe these matters or charge with these matters, but the overarching issue for us has been they're the directions of the Chief Health Officer and getting the clarity of those, and we enforce on those as well as using our discretion. If you like, there's been one big move, I think, probably, and that was a regulation change to allow protective services officers to come off the transit network. They still have the same powers though, but they're operating public for public reassurance and for protection of property. So no new powers, but new infringements that we are required to enforce to assist the Chief Health Officer.
And there was some news this morning in the press around the role in the future of PSOs and their expanded function under these conditions. So we may pick up on that a wee bit later. But turning first to Katie and then to Kristen, in terms of the oversight role of those new infringement charges that the Victoria Police have available to them, Katie, how are you oversighting that? Or what's changed at IBAC?
So, like most of Victoria, the biggest change for IBAC is that we are all working from home now. Outside of that change, it's business as usual for IBAC when it comes to overseeing both Victoria Police and indeed the public sector. So we continue to receive complaints and notifications, and we're continuing our investigations. When it comes to the use of police powers during the pandemic, we've probably taken more of a preventative approach. So the main thing that we've been doing is engaging with both Victoria Police and members of the community, such as the community legal sector and also our colleagues in the integrity sector, to really understand what approach Victoria Police is taking to the task of policing these directions, and also how they're managing the sorts of risks that are associated with a very quick and very broad scale rollout of not new powers, but certainly more laws that need to be policed and enforced across the state.
Kristen, in terms of VEOHRC's responsibility, the Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, are you seeing an increased number of complaints and concerns about human rights issues on the streets? Or, how is it playing for you?
Yeah, thanks, Lynne. And just an acknowledgement of country here. I'm coming from Boonwurrung country today, so pay my respects to elders past and present there. Similar to Katie, we have a role in relation to 3 acts. We've got a role under the Equal Opportunity Act, the Charter and the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act. And there are protections under all of those acts which have become extremely important during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we have received an increased number of inquiries, particularly in relation to race, both race discrimination and racial vilification. Now, our inquiry numbers around race have doubled from this time last year. A lot of people wanting just to report things that they've seen, and then others wanting to make a formal complaint. We've also received inquiries about discrimination on the basis of carer status, women, and also increasingly people with disabilities who are finding it difficult to access goods and services. We've also shown a keen interest in how children with disabilities are coping and who are perhaps not able to learn remotely during the school lockdown period. In relation to the police enforcement powers specifically, the Charter specifies a role and obligations for all public authorities, of which Victoria Police is one. So we have been in regular dialogue with Victoria Police during this period about the enforcement processes, helping them to, I suppose, keep in mind the impact that fining vulnerable people might have and how the use of the discretion is playing out across a really large number of people. When I say number of people, I mean the force it's a very big one. So you will get different uses of discretion. And we also have a statutory role to advise government in relation to equality and human rights issues. And I think now more than ever, that advice that government receives from its statutory bodies and from other civil society organisations is extremely important in helping them tailor their response to the pandemic.
You raise a very interesting point about the requirements under the Charter to manage issues in an appropriate way and not to overstep, if you like. Coming back to you, Shane, what are the guiding principles? I mean, as you say, you've got an enforcement capacity now that you didn't before in terms of infringing particular activities. But is there a guiding set of principles that sit behind that in terms of Victoria Police Command and where that discretion is best exercised?
Oh, yeah, most certainly. I mean, we're very cognizant of these restrictions that are being imposed on people, and human rights is something that we're trying to balance all of the time. Now, obviously, we've got restricted movement, if you like, of people and restricted activity to them, and by degree even restricted freedom of association, I should say. So there's a whole range of issues for us. But for me, it's been in all the discussions, in all the internal messaging we've done with our members, in the external messaging, in the emails, in everything we do, we simply say to our members, use your discretion, use your common sense, treat people the way you'd like to be treated yourself. In fact, in one of the messages I put out to them, I said, if you're wondering whether you should be issuing an infringement to someone or giving them a warning, then think, would I be satisfied that a member of my family was given an infringement on this occasion, or would a warning have sufficed? So it's sheeting home that personal accountability to our members, as well as we've obviously got our values, our organisational values, and in all of the operations, we have Operation Sentinel, which is 500 officers every day out checking for restrictions. We have Operation Shielding, which is 160 PSOs and 80 transit officers out patrolling and giving public reassurance. In all of these operations, we always have human rights underpinning everything we do. It's the messaging to our members, but it's about being decent and treating people the way you want to be treated yourself and applying that discretion where possible if we can. And that's been our emphasis all of this time. We keep saying this is a health issue. That's the basis of it. And we're merely trying to assist to stop the spread of this virus.
I mean, I think the way in which this has certainly had public coverage, Shane, has changed over the last couple of months. But there was a phase there where we were seeing perhaps some excessive zealousness on the part of some of your staff and members of Victoria Police. I mean, you yourself came out and said that you would review every infringement. Are you still doing that?
Yes, I am on a daily basis. Anything that gets reported from Operation Sentinel, I assess to make sure that it passes what I have termed publicly the common sense approach, and that it's valid. And there's a whole range of checks and balances in place as well on a weekly basis as a result of discussions with IBAC and Kay Miller. The recommendation was that, we should be checking not only individually but organisationally the areas at each of, if you like, the police stations where they're all coming from, to make sure we're not seeing excessive numbers from excessive pockets across the organisation. So we are constantly monitoring to make sure that there's not overreach, if you like, but there is a lot of complexity with this. What might seem very straightforward in apparent, simple, restricted activity directions and stay-at-home directions, you cannot be prescriptive for every possible scenario that occurs. And so there is a lot of discretion and a lot of tolerance necessary, and we will get it wrong occasionally. And as we have said, when we do, we will fix it.
Katie, Shane mentioned there that you've had a conversation between your organisations, and Kristen certainly mentioned that also. Are you looking for the systemic issues that arise in terms of police enforcement under these circumstances? Is that a role that IBAC plays in this circumstance, which it is particularly well suited to do? I think you'll need to come off mute, Katie.
I've been doing that the entire pandemic. So I think with any issue that IBAC looks at, we're always looking at both what is the individual issue that is raised by the complaint or the particular matter that we're looking at. But we've also always got an eye out for what does this tell us about the systems that inform the way that Victoria Police work as an entire organisation. I said in my introductory remarks that IBAC's really taking a preventative approach here, and that's because we recognise that this is an example of Victoria Police working as one whole organisation. I mean, this is a crisis that affects the entire state of Victoria, indeed the country, and so it's something that is really requiring Victoria Police to work as, sort of a cohesive unit. And so systems are just so vital and important here. We are never going to be able to respond in a timely and satisfactory way if we're just sort of playing whack-a-mole to complaints that are coming in. It's not to say complaints aren't important, but to really get ahead of the game, we need to look at what systems are in place. And that's why it's been so important to engage with Victoria Police, to understand what their approach is, how they're providing guidance to members across the state, often in very short periods of time, because the directions were introduced without, a lot of notice, and that's not a criticism, but they also have been changing fairly rapidly and often. And so understanding how you skill your members up in that way, and then also how do you monitor for the inevitable mistakes, inconsistencies, or just decisions that in hindsight the organisation doesn't want to be making those sorts of decisions. That's been really important. And I think Victoria Police has been quite, open to that sort of engagement, and as Shane just mentioned, has been very willing to take on some of our suggestions about how the system can be tweaked so that we are able to identify any themes that are emerging and deal with them before they become a problem for a lot of people.
I'm interested also in how the community has responded to address the circumstances that it finds itself in. And I think the beautiful piece of evidence around this, which got some coverage again today, is around the police assistance line, Shane. And the fact that we're getting pretty good at dobbing each other in. You're getting a huge number of reports of breaches of various constraints. Does that mean, do you think, that the community has taken this to heart and is really playing, a self-regulating role, as you said?
Oh yeah, the community has been absolutely fantastic in doing what we've encouraged them to do, in doing what the Chief Health Officer has encouraged them to do, and that is reporting any apparent breaches. And I know I sound like a broken record on occasions and have probably for the past month and a half, but it is so vital for them to report these breaches. And the only reason that we are doing what we are doing is to stop the spread of the virus and to save lives. And that's the whole basis of everything that we do. So the police assistance line, that has been amazing. When you think we received something like, and these aren't all coronavirus related, but it jumped up from 70,000 in March to 100,000 in April, and we've seen a significant number of breaches or apparent breaches reported, and we'll attend them. And we've given out thousands and thousands of warnings as well, just saying, listen, don't do it, stop this or whatever. But part of the messaging from me has been to the officers, if it's a deliberate, obvious and blatant breach that there could have been no ambiguity about, and you don't think that this can be dealt with by warning, then you need to be giving them an infringement.
Interesting. And Kristen, you mentioned earlier that you're also seeing a high number of reports around human rights infractions, some really awful behaviour, and we've certainly seen media coverage of some particularly egregious events as well. So in the same vein, do you think there is equal and opposite scrutiny, if you like, of people's misbehaviour in terms of the community standard, as well as the way in which people are responding to the new constraints that are imposed by VicPol and others?
Well, it's an interesting point, Lynne, because I think, most people would read about a racist incident in the paper or see it on the news and think that that was fairly abhorrent behaviour. But the fact of the matter is that we're seeing an increasing number of those sorts of incidents, and the ones that get reported to us really just skim the surface. The types of things like we had a complaint from a doctor who was catching public transport to work in a hospital during the pandemic and was terribly racially abused on public transport to the extent that he now can't use it to get to work. A woman of Asian background being told in a supermarket to get out of the supermarket because they take all the stuff. People being spat at. So while I think that there are some really positive community behaviours that we've seen on display during COVID-19, it's also bred fear and anxiety. And unfortunately, some people just succumb to those basest fears and anxieties during a time of crisis and look for someone to blame. And this is certainly what we're seeing in relation to incidents around racism and in particular targeting people of an East Asian background. So we have been really encouraging both people who have experienced that type of behaviour to report it to us, but also someone who's witnessed it. And it's a bit akin to what Katie was saying, that it's not just about trying to resolve an individual incident, because sometimes under our current legislative framework, that's really difficult to do. It's also about understanding in what pockets of the community is that happening. So we know, for example, that it's been really bad in supermarkets. We know that it's been really bad on public transport. Prior to schools shutting down, there'd been quite a lot of students of Asian background being targeted in schools. So where we collect that data and where we hear those stories, we're better able to work with those businesses or with those public authorities to try and take an educative and a preventative approach to helping to combat some of the racist behaviour that we're seeing during the pandemic. I should also note that it's quite timely that we're actually reviewing our racial, they're currently called the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act. And one of the points of the review, there's a parliamentary inquiry that's on foot at the moment, looks at whether we've got the balance right in terms of holding perpetrators of racism to account and whether those laws are actually easy enough for individuals in the community to access.
Very timely indeed. We'll look forward to the implications of recent experience being borne out in that review process. But I suppose I'm interested to explore the data a little bit further in not only the number of complaints or inquiries and reports that have come through both to the Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission and to Victoria Police under the Police Assistance Line. But the flip side, Shane, is that you have issued 3 times apparently more fines than other states and other jurisdictions. So what accounts for that? Why are you issuing so many more fines? Because it's not a cheap undertaking. It's what, about $1,600 for your basic infringement than say New South Wales.
$1,652 for an individual. It is a significant fine, and for a business, $9,913. So they are significant fines. And I'll accept the premise, Lynne. I'm not sure of how many the other states have issued, but accepting what you say, there's always complexity and difficulty in comparing apples and oranges, and what on the surface may appear to be the same scenario can be vastly different. And I don't say this by way of excuse or mitigation, but just to give context, and that is New South Wales, I don't know whether they've got what we've got, and that is a 500 strong, if you like, task force that is tasked every day to go out and check breaches and to be doing that. So there's that scenario. I don't know whether they've got all those PSOs out there. I don't believe they do have, and the transit police officers. So it's the 240 of them out. So we have 740 people out dedicated on a daily basis to enforce the Chief Health Officer's restrictions. Then there's the comparisons in the restrictions themselves. It's arguable from what I read that the restrictions in Victoria are some of the more stringent or more constraining than other states, and by having those, we have had them for longer periods of time, I believe, as well. So it's all about context, and I don't think that comparing them is necessarily able to be done because of the periods of time that those directions are in place for, the differences in directions, and also the number of directions and the time of the whole scenario. I think that's all I can say about that, other than to re-emphasise we have given out thousands and thousands of warnings as well, but it is a significant number of infringements. But having said that, there are a whole range of checks and balances in place. I'm assessing them on a daily basis, and where it's not right, I ask them to be withdrawn. A person who gets an infringement still has the whole scenario open to them, the process under the Infringements Act to make an application online, to have it reviewed and get a warning or potentially withdrawn, as well as there's the opportunity, lastly, to take it to court. And there are also special circumstances for people who are vulnerable persons and arranged under the Infringements Act. So there's a lot of checks and balances in place, and I continue to emphasise to our officers, to the police out on the road, this is about stopping the spread of the virus. It's not what we want to be doing. We do not want to be doing this, but it's helping save lives.
So the system holds, I think, is the method, is the message in short. The checks and balances are still in place, and the usual processes are still available to people if they do receive an infringement. But Katie, these are exceptional times, and they require a certain urgency and quick response. So with IBAC's responsibility for assessing complaints about police behaviour, how do you make decisions around responding to this under a pandemic circumstance?
So we're applying the same processes that we ordinarily do when we receive complaints and notifications about suspected police misconduct. I think what is different in this situation is really trying to identify what does normal policing look like in these very abnormal times. And that's why that early engagement with Victoria Police to understand what their approach was going to be. And that included also understanding how they would engage with some of the more vulnerable communities who might be disproportionately affected by this sort of pandemic policing, which Kristen has sort of averted to. So when we're bringing them in, we're still looking at the same questions that we always look at. We're looking at, does this complaint on its face give rise to a suspicion that there's been police misconduct? Is it something that warrants investigation? And if so, who is the appropriate body to be investigating it? Is it something that requires the full force and powers of IBAC, or is it something that we have confidence that Victoria Police will be able to investigate and manage it itself? And again, that's why that early engagement with Victoria Police was so important, to understand if complaints were going to come in, and we anticipated that obviously in these abnormal times, of course, people were going to have questions and concerns. So understanding how Victoria Police was going to manage those complaints was really important. We are also keeping an eye out for, are there sort of themes or concerns that are coming through those complaints that mean we need to raise them and have a further engagement with Victoria Police. So far that hasn't been necessary, but it's something that we're always keeping an eye to.
Kristen, I think you wanted to come in here.
Yeah, just a comment about how important it is to get, and Shane has talked about this, the issuing of the fine right in the first place. As a lawyer that has spent many years working at legal aid and community legal centres with infringements, it is not a fun system to navigate, whether you're a lawyer or whether you're a client. And so the last thing that we want to see, and I noted, I think in the paper today, that only a very small percentage of fines have been paid to date. But the last thing that we would want to see is that these fines cause even greater financial hardship to people who may already be struggling. And while, yes, you can go to court and there are special circumstances under the Infringements Act, what we really want to ensure is that those special circumstances are taken into account at the decision point about whether you issue a fine or whether you issue a warning. And Shane talked about the messages around discretion that are given to Victoria Police. The other thing I think to keep important, or to keep front of mind, is that the principles under the Charter, the principles that guide a human rights framework, which is this response necessary? Is it proportionate? And is it justified in the context? Are very useful tools to think about not just the issuing or enforcement of a fine, but really any action that government or law enforcement or public authorities are taking during this time. And that's why a lot of the focus that we have had over the last couple of months has been making sure that those charter principles are front and centre, both of the government's response, but also their plan for recovery out of COVID-19.
Which brings us to a very interesting question that's just, in fact, a thought I'd had, which has been preempted by a member of our audience this afternoon. To you, Shane, I think, in terms of the transparency around the application of infringements and who's getting them and where they are, and if there are particular groups that are disproportionately targeted, will Victoria Police release a breakdown of the demographics around infringements?
It's an interesting question, and one I really hadn't turned my mind to about release of it. I mean, we have nothing to hide in respect to how we're issuing our infringements, and we're giving, if you like, had been up until recently given daily tallies of the numbers we've been issuing, but to get down into the minutiae, the finer detail of certain demographics perhaps, or ages, gender and all of those things, I wouldn't be adverse to releasing it. It's a matter of when that and if that analysis can occur, and if our systems allow that analysis to occur, I would have no issue with releasing it.
Kristen, just back to you on that. Is that something you think would be useful?
I do, Lynne, and I know that New South Wales have released some of their data, and I think it also helps. What I would imagine that it would help not just an inquiry into where fines are being issued the most, if there's a particular demographic that is receiving more than others, or they're coming from a particular station or region within Victoria Police, but also what members of the community are struggling to comply. And lack of compliance isn't always motivated by doing the wrong thing or just sort of a flagrant breach of compliance. It might be in the early stages of the pandemic, for example, there are a number of multicultural communities who simply didn't receive the translated information necessary from DHS about exactly what the exceptions were. And so there was a bit of a rush to get those translated materials out to make sure that all parts of the community understood. And so analysing and also giving others an ability to analyse that data would help, I think, us understand, well, what parts of the communities are struggling, or what parts of the community need more assistance in terms of coping with some of the restrictions that have been placed on them during COVID-19.
Well, we're about to enter into another grey area as the relaxation ramps up, and I think, certainly personally, this is the phase that I'm, more concerned about, I think, than lockdown, because at least we kind of had a very clear picture after, a few issues were resolved at the beginning about what exactly was on and what was not. But now, as you described, Kristen, we're in a phase where there could be increasing confusion once again, and the communication to all elements of Victoria are critical in making sure that people don't attract undue attention from authorities. Shane, is this a phase that is also going to be tricky in terms of the enforcement task?
Yeah, each time the CHO directions change and there are different expectations, relaxation, if you like, of some restrictions, refinement of them, it is again a matter of making sure that right across this organisation of 16,500 police officers, that they're all updated with the new guidelines, they all understand what is required of them, and the enforcement expectation about it. But continuing, as I say, to underpin to all of them the reasons why we're doing it, which is about stopping the spread of the disease. So each time we have a change in restrictions, we assess it as an organisation, as an executive command, and put in place processes. And perhaps one example is when they changed at 11:59 p.m. on Tuesday, not this week, but last week, and there was an easing of restrictions. At that time, the day prior to it, I put out a message right across our organisation and put instructions in place that instead of our members issuing an infringement on the spot for these matters, that prior to issuing an infringement, they would have to be required to consult with their sergeant, with the supervisor, to make sure that there was no ambiguity associated with it, that it was a common sense approach and that it was valid to be issuing an infringement, so that we didn't have confusion, if you like, by any of our police officers, or where a member of the public might have done something and our member didn't show enough leniency, if you like, so they were forced and compelled to have a discussion with a supervisor prior to the issue of an infringement, and that is the case now as well. That's still in place to take away the issues with transitioning to different instructions in terms of CHO directions.
Katie, that's is a significant challenge, moving and perhaps in the next few weeks quite quickly into new phases of the relaxation. Do you have a role at IBAC in terms of negotiation with the state, with the Premier and key ministers around how that gets communicated and how quickly things can be relaxed to a point where there is likely full compliance?
No, so IBAC's role continues during pandemic times as it was before pandemic times. So IBAC's role is to expose and prevent corrupt conduct and police misconduct in the public sector. So we're not involved in the sort of policy discussions and the expert advice about when restrictions should be relaxed and how they go about it. When it comes to the pandemic, our approach has again been one of prevention. So we have been engaging with the public sector about, corruption risks that might be presented because of the circumstances of the pandemic. And as we've been discussing, our primary role has really been in overseeing the police approach to policing the CHO direction. So as things relax, we are interested and continue to monitor the changes in police approach, and something like the decision that members will need to get authorisation from a supervisor before issuing an infringement is an example of that system change. And I might just, on that system change, I think it ties in nicely with the conversation that was happening a little bit earlier about data and releasing data. And it just shows that when looking at data, it's important to have data both collected and then shared. But it's also necessary to understand the system that is producing that data. And what I anticipate we will see over coming weeks is a reduction in the number of infringements, both issued but also withdrawn. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there will have been a change in that review process, but by virtue of changing the system and introducing that that authorisation requirement before the infringement is issued, it will naturally have a flow-on effect to how many infringements are viewed as needing to be withdrawn.
Yeah, fair point. I'm going to follow the data train a little bit further because there was news this morning, Shane, around the crime stats across the board, and that a number of categories of crime, if you like, burglaries and the like, have dropped significantly at this time, which is probably just as well given that you've got other tasks to pursue. But how is that playing out in terms of your membership and their day-to-day operation?
Thanks, Lynne. Yeah, we have seen, and I'll use April, if you like, as we can't talk about actual crime figures because the Crime Statistics Agency are the only one authorised to put them out. But we have been in liaison with them to give the public a picture, if you like, of how crime is occurring or not occurring throughout this pandemic period. And for the month of April, we saw it at its lowest daily average since the same month in 2014. So the lowest daily average for 6 years in terms of crime occurring for the month of April. And we saw it playing out across a whole range of areas. Robbery was significantly down, assault was down, residential burglary was down significantly, commercial burglary was down, and we had some rises in other areas though. We had a slight rise in carjackings. In that high impact, high harm crime, we still, robbery was steady. So, but overall, we had significant declines in crime, which you would expect as well to see from, if you like, from the lack of persons being out and about on public transport, the lack of people wandering around the streets and everything with the restrictions in place. But at the same time, whilst we've seen those declines, every infringement that we issue is listed as a crime under our law enforcement system. And so, you know, we've seen 5,500 extra crimes recorded that we would never have seen before. So whilst we have, we've got some, you know, some offset there by not having to deal with as many crimes in the general theft of and from motor car area and the like, we're now being tied up with, if you like, the new infringements that have been issued and making sure people are moving on from restricted areas.
I'm interested in your thoughts, Kristen, around the relaxation as well. I mean, given that, as you said, before lockdown, we were seeing some pretty appalling behaviours in schools and other institutions which are now beginning to return, and we've got schools going back at least in part next week and beyond. Are you concerned that at this time we will see an even further strident increase in the number of those sorts of reports to your commission?
Look, it's hard to know. As I said, we've seen both, I think, some fantastic solidarity within the community and great acts of kindness, but also some, you know, some pretty terrible behaviour. And I expect that physical distancing and the fact that we've been in lockdown has meant that less incidents have happened and less incidents have been reported probably. So it wouldn't surprise me as we start to move around again, and particularly if we start to see, you know, I hope we don't, but we do see some small clusters of community transmission, and that makes people very, very nervous again, and then it leads to all sorts of anxiety, which can then result in recrimination and retribution to people who they think represent the virus in some way. So I think what needs to happen now is much greater community awareness and support, and I think the government has already put forward some pretty strong messages about how this state doesn't tolerate racism, but also support for those communities. And I think an understanding, and this is partly our job as well, about where you can report racism when and if it happens to you, or if you've observed it. So it's about getting the message across about how we want to reshape this community post-COVID-19 and to retain all of the fantastic things about the multicultural and diverse Victoria that we've had, and to not let those more base instincts around fear and retribution become a factor in our recovery period. But that will take deliberate strategies, and it will take all of us to some extent standing up to support other people.
Absolutely. As I said, I think more concerned about this relaxation phase and what it will mean for community transmission, and clearly that's the government's concern as well, and they're going about this in an exceptionally careful way. But Shane, just on the operational front, how does VicPol make sure that given you are on the streets, and as you said, you've got 740 people out there every day looking specifically at these issues and dealing with the general public, that you're keeping your members safe and members of the public safe, given that you do have physical contact at times with people?
Thanks, Lynn. And yeah, the 740, just for absolute clarity, they're the ones specifically assigned to this, but many thousands more out on patrol as well, dealing with this in their everyday duties. But how do we, are you saying keep our people safe in engaging in this process? We put in a whole range of, we assessed our service delivery at the start and tiered it so that we could understand what we could and shouldn't be doing, what were non-critical policing services. We stopped suspended, I should say is the word. We suspended bail reporting across the state, so that we worked through it and saw that people are on bail having to report to police stations 1, 2, or could be 7 days a week to make sure that they didn't leave or flee. We worked it through that was 40,000 visits to police stations on a monthly basis, and so with working with justice and the courts, we suspended those matters throughout the pandemic, and that still is the case at the moment, conducting risk assessment on only the highest individuals that we needed to put in place different monitoring methods. So that was one way of stopping 40,000 extra exposures potentially to the community, but contacts of our members at police stations. We've stopped counter inquiries occurring and a whole range of things. We've absolutely, you will have seen, we've gone to a different method, or you may have seen, instead of having our booze and drug buses where you have multiple people coming in and being tested multiple times because of the risk of transmission, we aren't doing that, but we are doing random tests in our cars. So it's looking at what service delivery was critical and altering that for our members. But safety is absolute priority for us, and it's the personal protective equipment, it's wearing all of that, it's the safety instructions and continual monitoring and removing areas of contact where they're not necessary for our members and for the public.
There have clearly been some really useful systemic changes in all that you've described, Shane, but I'm interested in how much of this sticks and whether or not there is lessons learned from this experience that will hold all three of your agencies in good stead beyond the pandemic. But Katie, first to you on this. Clearly you've had always had a very strong relationship with Victoria Police, but it would seem to me that has become very tight around the pandemic to ensure that the safeguards are well in place at the outset, as you've said, for prevention rather than having to pick up the pieces at the other end. Do you think that that relationship will survive this and is strengthened as a result?
It's interesting hearing your observation of that, Lynne, because I would probably say that what we've been able to achieve with Victoria Police and having that early engagement and having that, I won't necessarily say welcoming, but certainly openness to our continued interest and monitoring of the situation. I think that has been a reflection and a product of the relationship that has been developed before the pandemic. So there's always going to be a healthy tension between any agency and their oversight agency. And I think it's a matter of, if each party understands what their roles and responsibilities are and what the other party's roles and responsibilities are, then we can engage in a professional way that helps to improve policing and community confidence in policing across Victoria. So rather than seeing this as the new normal or abnormal, it's probably the results of good work done before the crisis means that we've been in a good position to perform our respective roles during the crisis.
And would you concur, Kristen? I mean, I think what we are seeing is some flexibility in response from various agencies, and certainly Victoria Police in its role as well. Are there lessons that we can take out of this that are valuable for the way in which we manage community policing and engagement from here on?
I think there definitely are, and I mean, prior obviously to Corona, we had engaged with Victoria Police on a big piece of work around sexual harassment for about 4 years, and through that work, we had developed really good relationships with executive command and really people all throughout Victoria Police, and that actually put us in a good position to be able to pick up the phone and say, we're a little bit concerned about this, or can you give us, this is what's being reported in the media, but how's it working on the ground? And the ability, I think, for agencies like Katie's and mine, other civic society organisations to be able to have that open and trusted dialogue with Victoria Police. We're not going to agree on everything, obviously, but for us to be able to help each other and inform each other and be frank with each other is incredibly important. And I would say that we've also experienced that with other public authorities and government departments throughout COVID-19. And the other thing that I think, in a strange sort of way, really, I hope what COVID-19 also emphasises is just how important a Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities is here in Victoria. We still remain one of the only 2 states in Australia that has one. And even though this is a period through our state's history where rights have probably been more limited for good reason in lots of cases than ever before, I think the Charter has definitely played a very important role in helping to test and probe and develop some rigour around what those limitations are. Do they continue to be necessary? Are they proportionate? They must be time-bound. All of those things that must go into any thinking around the development of new laws or policy where you're looking at fundamentally restricting people's rights. And so if this invigorates the role of the Charter, and the way in which public authorities understand it and the way in which individuals feel connected to it, then I think that is a positive thing to come out of this.
Shane, I've heard it said, and this is, I think, reflected in comments both from Kristen and Katie, and I think it was a commentary out of the US that described the experience of the pandemic as an X-ray on the state of the society, where there were, little fractures before, they've been magnified, where there were strong relationships in the past, they have found, to have worked well. What do you think that X-ray process has revealed about your Victoria Police?
Gee, that's an interesting.
Just an easy question, yeah.
Yeah. Look, I think what it's revealed is that we are human, that we won't get everything right all the time. I think it's revealed we're very receptive to change, and we're an agile organisation that is able to adopt a whole range of different processes and procedures and quickly get things done. But for us, I think it's revealed that our relationship with the community is essentially a very sound one that's right across a range of different communities right across the state. And that's based on the fact that we have, as has been said before, an analogy for me is you don't learn to dance on prom night. And that's the reality. These relationships have been established over a long, long period of time. And then you come to a critical juncture like we have here in this pandemic, and you're able to draw on the trust we've already developed in those relationships and if you like, draw on some of those credits and have the public trust and go on the journey with us. And, it's been a little bit rocky at the start, but we are receptive to advice, and we've taken that on board in a number of instances. And we show that, as I said before, if we don't get it right in a couple of minor matters, we'll fix it. And I think importantly, we've shown to the public that we don't consider ourselves above the law. And I'll reference the tragic death of our 4 colleagues on the 22nd of last month, which is an absolute tragedy for our organisation. I mention it to show that we were bound by the same rules that applied to other persons in the funerals relative to our 4 members. We would normally have seen thousands upon thousands of police officers line the streets to see those officers at the finish and to commemorate their lives at the finish of the funeral, but we were limited to 10. And we adhered to those rules because we don't consider ourselves above the community, but a part of the community. And I think it's being a part of the community that has stood us in good stead for here and for the future.
I think it's certainly the case that the community took that process very, very keenly to heart. I mean, even walking around my neighbourhood, the number of blue and white ribbons on fence posts was quite remarkable. So I think you should feel very supported by the community, as I think the community generally feels very supported by Victoria Police through all of this. But just to drill right down, what are you hearing from people on the beat, from your officers who are out literally walking the pavements? What is their experience of the pandemic, and what do you think they will take out of this as individuals and as members of Victoria Police? What's the personal experience?
The personal experience is, like every other member of society, they are scared to a degree. They experience exposure to people. There's personal experiences where we have offenders who spit on us and say, I have COVID, and so you now do. There's people who assault you and also who just stand there and say, I've got the COVID virus, and use it as an excuse to try and get out of being arrested. There are people who are in need of our assistance who are suffering mental health issues, or where we attend collisions, who are potentially at risk of or exhibiting symptoms of the COVID virus. And so there's a whole range of issues, and it's going into the unknown environment. And that's what our members deal with every single day. We've had numerous members who've had to be quarantined. I know of a couple of members, 4 of them went to an incident, and the person was potentially suffering coronavirus, COVID-19. So as a result of that, 2 of the members self-isolated at their home address, but the other one had a pregnant wife, so they couldn't go home to them. They were put up in a hotel. Another one had young children, and he chose not to go home to them. So it's then a couple of, whatever the period of time is until the other person gets cleared. So what am I feeling on a daily basis? Our members are absolutely, they're doing their job. They're taking all the precautions they can do, but they're humans at the end of the day, and they suffer the same risk and the same fears as everybody else, but they go about their job. But they're also feeling tremendously supported by members of the public in general, and the support has been very strong and comforting.
Well, I'm relieved to hear that, because I think for those people who do have to step out of their homes to do their jobs, and Victoria Police are preeminent amongst the people who are required to ensure that we stay as safe as we can. It's a scary prospect at times. I think we will wrap our conversation there, but it's been absolutely fantastic to have you as part of Law Week. Thank you to you all as panelists, and certainly to the audience as well. It's been a conversation about overseeing the use of police powers during the COVID-19 pandemic with Shane Patton, Deputy Commissioner, Victoria Police, Katie Miller, Deputy Commissioner, IBAC, and Kristen Hilton, who is the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commissioner. And I've been in Haultain, and I remain in Haultain from the Victoria Law Foundation. It's been a great pleasure talking with you, and have a splendid Friday afternoon.
Thank you.